My name is Rebecca. I'm doing a panel about putting your best plot forward, how stories and everything work. And hopefully what I hope that you guys kind of get out of this is a basic knowledge of the basic plot structure, which is the hero's journey, and hopefully a little bit how to use it and how you can mess with it to make it your own. Because it's in literally like everything, but we still have thousands of unique stories that come out of this plot structure. So just FYI, I guess, pretty sure this was in the panel description, but if you missed it, we're going to talk a lot about Harry Potter, Sailor Moon, and Star Wars, specifically A New Hope and A Sorcerer's Stone from Harry Potter. So if you haven't seen them, lots and lots of spoilers, like the whole plot spoilers. But I kind of picked them because I figured most people have either seen them or don't care.
Yeah, I don't care.
There are some other things in there, but I tried to pick things that are really common, so hopefully most of you will already know what's going on when I talk about them. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about just a little bit is the hero's journey, which is kind of almost the plot of everything. We don't always see it because they sometimes disguise it with a romance or a mystery and those kinds of plots, but it's there, it's underlying in almost everything. And the reason for this is because if you pay attention, you'll notice that it actually happens in your real life. Maybe not in the same way, maybe it doesn't always end as happily as stories do, but you'll see these elements, these moments happen in your real life. You'll find yourself in a moment where you're like, oh, I have a chance to do something new. Maybe this is my call to adventure. Okay? I'm going to talk about the hero. This can be literally whoever your main character is. It doesn't matter. Girl, boy, neither. Doesn't matter. Human, animal, whoever the story's about. That's going to be our hero.
Yeah, and literally, sometimes they get like disguised by making like basically main character a complete monster, but that's still a hero's journey.
Yeah, it's still, so when I say hero, I imagine whoever you want, it doesn't matter. So like we said, this can be anyone from anywhere, and more than one character in a story can go through the hero's arc. In fact, most of them do. They'll do it at different paces and different times, depending on their role in the story, but a lot of them will still actually go through this. Some characters will go through the different points at the same time. They'll go through them at different points. Like I said, depending on their role in the story. And there can be hero's journeys within journeys. You'll see this a lot of times in things that are serialized, like comic books and televisions that have episodes. You might get a mini hero's journey in every single episode, especially in like Monster of the Week kind of things. They'll do this every week and then have an overarching plot that also follows this. And then we also talk about the dramatic question. And the dramatic question is a narrative question that the story answers. So it's not like a, how do robots affect our world kind of question. It's not that kind of global question. It's specific to the narrative. One of the best examples is, will Dorothy get home from Oz? It's that question. Like, it doesn't talk about how we affect it, but that's what we want to know, ultimately. As soon as Dorothy gets to Oz, we're like, okay, is she going to get home? Will Dorothy find a way home? So that's one of the examples of the dramatic question. All right. So basically, this is a 12-step program. We're not going to go over all 12 steps because that's kind of a lot. If we have a little bit of extra time or something, we might go back and hit some of those, but the highlighted ones are the ones we're really going to talk about today. The five that are in blue are called the 5 key plot points. And basically, if you don't have them, you almost don't have a story. Now, storytellers use them in different ways, and not all storytellers tell their story in order, which is a perfectly legitimate choice. But basically, at some point, the author, the writer, the creator has to know what these are. So the first thing is the ordinary world. We'll talk more in detail about that one, but it's basically whatever the hero's doing right now. Then we have the call to adventure that calls them out of that ordinary world. Most heroes often refuse the call. They're like, hey, do you want to do this? No, that sounds awful. I don't want to do that. And then we meet the mentor, who is the person who helps them through this journey. Obi-Wan, yes. And sometimes meeting the mentor can actually happen later or earlier than this. Sometimes they've known the mentor their whole life, but they take on that role of mentor at some point in the story. All right, then we have the lock-in or crossing the threshold. This is where the character's not getting out of the story anymore. They have to do it. Then we have test allies and enemies. This is kind of the, where you meet your group of friends, you build your army, you maybe, there's often battles depending on the kind of story. You find the first clue, if it's a detective story usually, that kind of thing. There's often a test, which is just something the hero has to do to prove themselves worthy of whatever it is that's coming next. Then we have the approach, which is just the build-up to your first main climax. It's when they get sucked into the Death Star in A New Hope. That's basically the approach. And then we have the midpoint mirror. This is the first really big climax, the first thing that's like, oh my gosh. And it's, we call it the mirror because it reflects the end. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, go into more detail. And then we have the reward, and the reward is, they've done like the first half of their journey. You know, they pulled the sword out of the stone, but we still don't have the kingdom yet. So we, you know, there's more work to be done, but the reward is, they often call it the bar scene, where all of the friends get together, they're like, yeah, we did it, except there's more coming, obviously, we know that. And then we have the death, and this gets called a lot of different things, and it's not always a literal death, but it's the very darkest moment of the story. Some places will call it the dark night of the soul, unless we're talking about a tragedy, but more about that later. This is where we think it's over, or as the audience, you're thinking it can't possibly be over, there has to be more, and there usually is. But it's where everything goes really, really terribly wrong. And then we have the resurrection, which is where whatever happens to fix it is gonna happen. Sometimes this is called the twist. I don't like calling it that because you can put a twist pretty much anywhere in your story where you go, oh wow, so that was this, or that was, you know, it doesn't have to be here, but oftentimes there is kind of that twist, but it's the twist that fixes it, not the twist that ruins everything, unless it's a tragedy, all right? And then we get back to the new normal. They'll call this the denouement, or the winding down of the story. But basically this is whatever the hero's gonna be doing after the story is over. And we just get a little peek of that. Okay, so like I said, we're gonna talk about the ones that are highlighted in a little more detail, and I've got some specific examples for you of things that are either very typical or very not typical in some cases of what these things look like. So we're gonna start with the ordinary world. So again, it's whatever the hero was doing before the story actually starts. Something is always missing or changing for the hero. Like I said, I have a few specific examples, but usually the heroes, they're not completely satisfied, or something about their world is wrong.
Or they're poor.
I mean, that could be it, but that's not always it. It doesn't actually have to be boring, because it's not our world that we're talking about. So the hero doesn't have to be bored, it doesn't have to be a boring, ordinary world. They're normal life.
Like they have no money.
Yeah. I mean, that could be. It just depends on the kind of story you're trying to tell. That could be what's wrong. You know, and it doesn't have to be our ordinary world. Like, Luke never sets foot on planet Earth, but he still has an ordinary world. So we don't, you know, if you're writing a story, it doesn't have to start here. Which seems pretty obvious, but, you know, I have talked to people and they're like, so it's gotta start in the normal world? No, don't, you don't have to do that. Sometimes you do, but the hero can be happy or the hero can be miserable. The hero may not realize anything is wrong, but to the audience, there's always something that you pick out that's like, that's not okay. Yeah, it's whatever's normal for them. So if you have multiple heroes, you could have multiple ordinary worlds. Now, you may not like change planets or change dimensions, but you can, depending on what story it is. But for example, in a romance, you can have two people with two completely different ordinary worlds. You've got to show them both to the audience at some point. Like I said, you don't always have to start your stories here. These things can be revealed through a flashback or, you know, through the course of the story. But usually we get some kind of picture of the ordinary world at the beginning. It doesn't have to be their entire backstory either. You can continue with their backstory, like I said, through flashbacks or through conversations, dialogue, whatever you want to do to reveal that. But we usually get some kind of picture of what they're doing. So, for our examples, so we're gonna start with Usagi, Sailor Moon. She's an ordinary middle school Japanese student. That's her normal world. She's always late, and she's kind of ditzy and a little lazy. So as we can see that what's wrong with her world are kind of flaws in herself. And to an extent, depending on which version of this you watch, we never really get over that. But that's kind of what's there. And then we have Luke on Tatooine, who's a moisture farmer. And he's bored. He's super bored. And whiny. So whiny. So what's wrong can be a flaw within the hero or a flaw within the world. We also see the flaw within the world in Star Wars because we start to see the Imperial troops on Tatooine. And we recognize that they're kind of that faceless bad guy empire who just wants to make life miserable for everybody. And then of course we have Harry and his poor little closet. It's really obvious what's wrong with Harry's world. So wrong. We also do get to see, I couldn't find a bajillion pictures of it, but we also learn a little bit about how Harry is different from everyone around him. We hear about the incident with the snake and a couple other things that, we're not quite sure what they are the first time you read it. But then we learn that Harry's different from the people around him. And also, he lives in the cupboard under the stairs. Like, we want something to happen in all of these cases because they're not good. Then, the picture in the upper left-hand corner, right-hand corner, my bad, is, it is the left? Yeah.
Our left, your right.
Yeah, okay. It's left on my screen, I wasn't sure. That's from Captain America Civil War. And I wanted to talk about this one because it's the perfect example of a not boring, ordinary world. Literally, we open that movie with a battle scene in, I don't remember the small African country now, but they're fighting bad guys because that's their ordinary world. And for us, it's not ordinary at all. It's super exciting because, it's that battle scene. And it just, it wasn't the original ordinary world for these people because they've been through this arc 4 or 5 times now. But we start there in that movie because that is what they're doing. We get the idea that they do this a lot. They go out, they fight bad guys, that's their job. Here, it's a little bit difficult to determine exactly what's wrong, but we do get that element of, Steve still has problems when you bring up Bucky, as well as that particular mission doesn't go very well. So we see that there might be a problem or something about to change in their ordinary world. A really common one that we see a lot for more realistic fiction, if that's what you're into, is if you're doing a coming of age story, is that they're about to move. So their ordinary world is perfectly ordinary, but they're in one neighborhood and maybe nothing's wrong, or maybe the hero doesn't perceive of anything being wrong, but they're about to move, and so there's a change coming the hero can't do anything about. So that's kind of the idea of the ordinary world. All right, and then we have the call to adventure. And this often points out what's missing to the hero, because sometimes they know, sometimes they're really bored, sometimes they live in a cupboard. But it points out what's wrong or what's missing to, if the audience can't pick it out, it'll point it out. Oftentimes it points it out to the hero. So this is just whatever happens that says, hey, there's a new opportunity, there's a new, something's about to change. We're gonna give you information that says that you have an option here. There's a way out of your ordinary world. So the hero at this point still has a choice. They can choose to continue, or they could just stay wherever they are. It's not so final that we have to have a story. And so sometimes authors will give you a character that chooses not to do this, that chooses not to accept the call, but then they're often not the hero because they can't have a hero without a story, because then it's boring, it's not a story. All right, and this often poses the dramatic question. Sometimes we get that posing a little bit later. This will often ask the question, will they or won't they? Is Dorothy gonna get home? But actually Dorothy's comes a little later. But the call to adventure can be something that's internal or external, or depending on the complexity of your story, even both. When we see I'll talk a little bit about Luke. He has an internal call because he's bored. He doesn't want to be stuck on Tatooine as a moisture farmer for the rest of his life. He already has kind of that internal call to adventure. The hero, however, almost always refuses the call at first. Not always. Again, it depends on the complexity of the story that you're telling. A children's book may not have a refusal of the call. But the hero's almost always like, no. Sometimes someone else refuses for the hero. We'll see that in a minute with Harry. And this happens about an eighth of the way through the story. I know that that's like really complicated, but that's about, because one of the big things that the hero's journey does is help you with pacing, so you don't get stuck too long, which a lot of animes actually do. So you don't get stuck too long in one place. Okay, so we have some calls to adventure here. We have Sailor Moon. For Sailor Moon, it's the moment when Luna first gives her that transformation. Some people, I almost picked it when she finds Luna, but honestly at that point that's a demonstration of her character in the ordinary world, more so than the actual call to adventure. When Luna shows up and starts talking to her, that says there's a story, there's a way out of your ordinary world, it's gonna, something could change. But at this point she hasn't actually done anything. She could decide not to be a superhero. For Harry, it's when all the letters arrive. He gets a letter that says, guess what? There's this place called Hogwarts, and you get to come. And that's a trigger for changing his ordinary world. Now, Harry would be perfectly happy to accept. So his refusal of the call is actually done by the Dursleys. They refuse the call for him. They throw all the mail away, they stuff him, they move to a shack to try to hide. Of course, this doesn't work because it's wizards. But that's the moment for Harry. But the technically be the first letter arriving. This was a much more fun picture. For Luke, his external call, the call that says there's something you can do about that internal call, is when we get the message from Leia. Because that's when he realizes there's something going on and there's something he can do about it. He realizes that Obi-Wan might be old Ben, for example. And then in Narnia, I wanted to talk about that one a little bit because we actually kind of get two. We get one for Lucy, which is essentially her finding the wardrobe and going through it and meeting Mr. Tumnus and all of that stuff. And then we get a different one for Edward and Susan and Peter. And that happens sometimes when you have a group of heroes like that. They do go through most of the story together and have most of their climactic moments together, but this actually comes differently. For Lucy, it's her own curiosity that becomes the call to adventure. She just decides to go into this wardrobe and find out what's there. But she acts as the caller to her brothers and sisters, saying, there's another world through the wardrobe, let's check it out. Which, has very good results. So, like I said, the important thing here is that they still have a choice. The Pevensies could not go through the wardrobe. They could tape it up shut and run away. Luke could totally stay on Tatooine if he wanted to. Harry is kind of being forced to stay with the Dursleys even though he doesn't want to, but they could make him at this point. All right, which brings us to that next plot point, which is the lock-in, which is the hero no longer has a choice. The hero is in the story, they're doing whatever it is they're doing. Up until this point, they've had a way to get out of it, but they don't anymore. Whatever the problem is only going to be resolved through a story. It signifies the hero leaving the ordinary world behind. Whatever it was, they've left it behind. And this can be they physically leave, or it can be more metaphorical, like, you start a new middle school. Your best friend moves away, which doesn't involve any of the hero leaving, but maybe that's what happens to make their story move forward. It may involve crossing an actual border. There's a reason it's called crossing the threshold. Sometimes you have to take a step through something physical that kind of metaphorically represents this. Like, many of the stories, the numerous anime that involve dungeons, you actually have to go in the dungeon. You don't have to cross the door, you have to go through it. And sometimes the hero's not given a choice. Sometimes the lock-in happens to the hero. They get shoved through the door. They get picked up by a tornado and dropped in Oz. Dorothy was not given a choice on that one.
Kind of seems like a Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, Wizard of Oz is a really basic story. It follows this almost exactly, and one of my favorite books that talks about this uses it a lot. So, and it's literally the most watched movie ever. They've done the math. More people have seen The Wizard of Oz than any other movie, so it's a pretty safe bet for no spoilers. All right, and this happens about a quarter of the way through the story, and is usually a pretty climactic moment. It's, depending on the genre that you're working with, it may or may not be quote unquote exciting, but it usually feels like something has changed. So for Usagi, we have the moment that she actually fights a bad guy. Once she decides to accept Naru's call for help, she really becomes Sailor Moon. She becomes that hero. No matter what happens now, she is Sailor Moon. Hers is a little more complicated, like I said, because hers is so episodic. She goes through this arc in the first episode. We're going to talk about it over the course of the first season, but she does go through this arc in just the first episode. So in theory, she could stop after that, but really this is the moment when she becomes Sailor Moon. For Luke, the Empire burns down his house and kills the people he was living with. He's kind of not given a choice. Not that he didn't want to leave in the first place, but he's kind of not given a choice. So this is his lock-in. He doesn't have anywhere to go, so he's going to go with Ben and help the resistance. For Harry, it's crossing platform 9 3/4. I wanted a really cool gif of him going through it, but the only one I could find was from the second movie where he crashes into it, which is funny, but not the right plot. So up until then, he technically has a choice. He could go home to the Dursleys, but once he crosses platform 9 3/4, which again is a physical barrier that he has to cross, it's really his first experience with like magic, because he has to go through and he has to do that to continue with his story. And then he's on the train to Hogwarts. He's going. We're in the story. This GIF, I'm not sure, is from the right episode of Rin, but definitely the first time he opens that sword is definitely his lock-in. There's no going back. He's now the half-demon son of Satan. Okay, he can't deny it anymore. He grows a tail. There's no going back. Like I said, this is probably from a different episode, but it's really cool. So that's his, and so you can see how he's given a choice to open the sword, but then once it's open, he doesn't have a choice anymore. Okay, so the next section would actually be the test, like the test allies and enemies portion, where we meet a bunch of characters and everything, but there's so many things in that we're going to go on to the next main plot point, which happens about another quarter of the way through the story, which is the midpoint year. So this is what you might think of when you think of the main climax of the story. It's actually not, but it's often really exciting. The hero has one of the key factors of this point is that the hero has a death, a near death, or a metaphorical death experience, or often we have another character die. And again, depending on the story, if you're writing a story about a middle schooler in the ordinary world, a coming of age in our normal world, chances are nobody's gonna die. But they might. It might be a grandmother who has cancer. I don't know. Depends on the story. But that's where the metaphorical death comes in. A metaphorical death is anything that makes you feel like you want to die. Okay, whatever, they did something and now no one is going to talk to them at lunch anymore because they have done it. They have died a social death. That kind of thing is a metaphorical death. Or they may just come really close to death, or have something so big, so terrible, so tragic, that it may not be an actual dying, but it could definitely result in the end of everything. It's a huge risk on that behalf of the hero. Overall, it's gonna have the same feeling as the end of the story, which sounds a little weird, but it's by the end of this moment, either we've had a partial victory, or they come out of it stronger. The hero here often displays, it's their first chance to display whatever it is that they need to learn. Luke has to display that he can be a Jedi. So we see a moment where he has the fortitude and the courage to do that, to become who he's supposed to be. It's usually a victory, not always. Again, there's a little bit more about that later. And this is halfway through the story. If you're telling it in order, still a valid choice not to tell your story in order. But for the heroes, time flowing linearly, this is halfway through the story. Okay, so Usagi's is a little weird. I switched to Crystal here because they actually did a really terrible job of this in the first season. Or not the first season, the first anime. They spent way too long in the test trials and LAs, like 40 episodes, too long. So she actually kind of has two, because she actually has two plot lines. She has the plot line of defeating Queen Metallia, sorry. And she also has the plot line of falling in love with Tuxedo Mask. This is from episode 9. In the plotline of defeating Queen Metallia, the midpoint is actually when she discovers that she's Princess Serenity. They fight Queen Metallia for the first time, and they don't win, but they survive, ultimately, and they found their princess who they've been looking for this whole time, because it's Usagi, or Serena, if you remember the old one. That actually happens in about episode 10. They give the midpoint of the actual series to her romantic plotline. It's where it's where they kiss for the first time. Another kind of, like, if you're telling a straight up romance, that would probably be a pretty good midpoint. You know, getting to that first big relationship milestone, whatever you choose it to be. For Star Wars, and this is just A New Hope, not the overarching 3, okay? It's the trash compactor scene. His death comes in that we see him get sucked under by whatever it is that lives in the trash compactor. And we think he's dead, and then he comes back up and he's still gonna die because he's gonna get crushed by a trash compactor. And this is the moment where it sounds strange, but like they're so happy when they don't get crushed. That's what makes it the midpoint climax, because we have that first taste of like, yeah, we did something, we have actually saved the princess now, let's get out of here as fast as possible. For Harry, it's his first big Quidditch game, where he catches the golden snitch. This is a huge deal, and even though it's not a battle with Voldemort, it really displays that Harry has the leadership qualities and the fortitude to face whatever version of the Dark Lord it is this time. This is, again, just the Sorcerer's Stone, not the overarching 7-book saga. So the thing with series is you can do this more than one time, and you'll have it overarching. It's a little bit better than the Monster of the Week stuff, but and it's a big deal. And then the death comes in the fact that Quirrell's trying to kill him. Quirrell's trying to knock him off the broom. We don't know it's Quirrell, but he almost does die. If you think about it, he almost falls off that broom before Snape stops him. Or a combination of Snape and Hermione, anyway. So the fourth one, if you can't tell, that is from Fruits Basket. It is actually the end of the anime, but that's not where the story ended, which is, there were many reasons that anime ended before the manga, but this was actually the halfway point. This is where Kyo reveals his third awful, horribly smelly form, actually, to Tohru, and where she displays that she can love him in any form. They don't actually get together at this point, but that's their midpoint, because ultimately what we want is for the curse to be broken, and that's not what happens here. If you just watch the anime, it would be a very good example of somebody who just stops too early. I mean, that's literally what happens. They just stop too early. But the manga continues to the point where they actually break the curse and they end up together and they get married and they have kids. It's great. But this is the midpoint because the revelation of Kyo's form could result in the death of his relationship with Tohru. That's kind of their near-death experience there. Nobody almost actually dies, but it's almost the death of that relationship. Or it could be if Tohru didn't have the right kind of attitude. So now, we're going to talk about the actual death. So again, this is the death of the story. And again, it can be literal or metaphorical or a very, very near-death experience. Some characters do actually die and come back. We've seen it lots of times. But oftentimes it's very, very near death, or we think they're dead for a time, even if they don't actually die. So depending on the story, you may or may not have a villain. But if you do have a villain, chances are this is where you think, oh my gosh, did they just win? But then you're like, but they can't, because it's a Disney movie and it has to have a happy ending. And you kind of wonder what's gonna happen to fix this. Sometimes they don't do that. That's actually a slightly different plotline. But if the villain is present, they kind of seem to win. So this is like that moment where you're like, oh, in the theater, where you're holding your breath. Or in your book, you're like, I can't turn the page, but I have to, because I have to know what happens. It's about 3/4 of the way through the story. And literally, it's just where everything that could possibly go wrong that makes logical sense in the story goes wrong. You know, the moment they were counting on falls through. The villain has some secret up their sleeve. They get betrayed. Betrayal is a really common death because it's the death of a relationship, whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship. Lots of betrayal. So here we literally have like Coral choking Harry in that scene where they get the Philosopher's Stone. So there's lots of stuff that happens in between.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Is the entire Harry Potter series about Harry's getting screwed over?
Kinda. Harry wins in the end, but yes. Speaking of Harry, he's one of our characters that literally dies. Not here, but in the 7th book, the ultimate death of Harry Potter is when he actually dies, because that's the only way to get rid of Voldemort. Not the best picture for Star Wars, but that's because it was kind of hard to find. This is the trench run where he's trying to get to the portal, basically. He's got to shoot the thing through the portal. Exhaust port. There we go. Like I knew I knew the name. It's kind of the whole battle scene is kind of that death, but what it really is it sounds weird. It's the moment when all of his friends are gone. There's no one to back him up and Darth Vader's on his tail. There's seemingly no way out of this as things stand. Like I said, it's not the best picture, but it's the best I could. It's that moment where you're like, holy cow, he has no backup. There's no one to shoot that ship that's trailing him and is gonna shoot him down. It's that moment in the Death Star battle. For Sailor Moon, again, she kind of has two at this point. This picture is actually of the one with her relationship with Nomura, where she has basically just tried to kill them both. Because that's the only way to get the silver crystal out of him. And he's dead, so she's gonna die too. There's also the moment when Queen Natalia actually encircles the whole Earth. She seemingly has gotten what she wanted, which is to cover the whole Earth and make it her own darkness. Her relationship with Mamoru has obviously reached a death when they seemingly die. They're not actually dead, but they're pretty close. And this is from The Emperor's New Groove, and I just really like it because it really hits the nail on the head. The villain has the thing that you need. She's won. She's done it. Almost. So then we have the resurrection. And this is sometimes called the third act twist. I'm not gonna go into 3-act plot structure, but basically 3-act plot structure here. It usually fixes whatever caused the death. You kind of like, okay, it's gonna be fine. It may not be done, but you're like, it's gonna be fine. I know it's gonna be fine now. Or you know that it's definitely not going to be fine now. The other note here is like, this is just whatever happens when the hero, it kind of makes you realize that either the hero has finally displayed that one thing that they were lacking. They have met the challenges. Star Wars kind of has two, and I'll talk about that because there's kind of like I said, the more plot lines you have, the more they come together at this moment. Because there's the Luke becoming the Jedi plot line, there's the let's please blow up the Death Star before they destroy another planet plot line. So the more that you have, the more they'll kind of come together in one or two scenes, moments in the story. So it just kind of, it can vary. Sometimes these points are a little niggly, depending on which arc you're kind of following. So, again, Sailor Moon, this is the moment where it's kind of actually the moment where she wakes up inside Queen Metallic, because she's absorbed her memorial at this point. Where we realize that she and Moro are both still actually alive. We're like, oh, they're not dead. Okay, they can still save the day because they're not dead. There's a lot of stuff that happens after this. They actually have to do the defeating of the villain. It's not always the moment where the villain goes down. Sometimes it is. But a lot of times it's the moment where you realize that they can take down the villain. In this case, you realize that if Sailor Moon's not dead, then she can still defeat the villain. For Harry, it's when we discover the Quirrell can't touch him. Because a Quirrell, he's literally, he's got Harry in a chokehold, he's gonna kill him. But then he pulls back because Harry's burning him. Magically, basically. And so you're like, oh, well, if the villain can't touch him, then Harry can win, because the villain can't do anything, basically.
Magic, so
yeah. And he already has the stone in his pocket at this point. But now, and all Harry has to do to defeat Quirrell is touch him. It's literally what he does. For Luke, there's kind of two moments. The first is when Han Solo shows up. Han Solo has abandoned the rebellion, and then he comes back and shoots down the ship that's trailing Luke, allowing him to make that shot. That's kind of that moment where we're like, oh, okay, the Millennium Falcon's back, now Luke's got somebody at his back that can fight these people off while he makes that shot. The other one is when he decides to turn off his computer and make the shot using the Force. Because that's when he takes that first step to becoming a Jedi. That's what he couldn't do before, that he's doing now. He's using the Force like a Jedi would, not relying on the things he's relied on for the whole story. For Disney's Hercules, literally, he's in the river of death, and they're gonna cut his life cord, and then the scissors don't work, because he's a god, and the thread can't be cut. It's very literal. Sometimes this moment is called a Deus Ex Machina moment. Now, usually that's not a term you want in reference to your story, because it's come to mean something magically comes in and fixes everything, and it's kind of weird, and why did that happen? In Greek, particularly in Greek comedies, not in Greek tragedies because everybody dies, but in Greek comedies this would literally be the moment when one of the gods would show up and go, all right, listen, this is what actually happened, I'm just gonna fix it now. That's not really a great storytelling technique anymore, although admittedly in comedy it can be kind of funny when you just have something random happen that just fixes everything. But it's kind of that moment when the one thing you don't think is gonna happen comes back and fixes it all. So then we have a new normal for the hero. This kind of wraps up loose ends. If you have subplots, the two side characters who are totally gonna end up together, but they're not the heroes, so we haven't been talking about them. This is when you give them that kissing scene so that we all know they're together. We kind of give the audience an idea of what the characters' lives are like now. It doesn't have to be really in depth. Some movies just kind of stop. Some of them give you a little bit more information. Some of them set you up for the next movie a little bit, or arc or book or whatever. Sometimes the heroes go back to the exact same world that they left, except now that they've changed. They're more grown up. They've accomplished a goal. They've set up something new that is going to help them. They're maybe in a new relationship. Maybe that's the goal. That's what happens in romance anyway. They've caught the killer, but they're still a detective. you know, that's what's, if you're writing like a mystery novel or whatever. Okay, some don't go back at all. Some of them stay on a new world. You know, especially when it actually involves getting sucked into other dimensions, a lot of them choose to stay there. Not all of them, but a lot. And this will be the normal until a new story starts, which for some characters is the next book, and for some characters never happens. Just depends. And this answers the demanded questions. Does Dorothy get home from Oz? Yes, she's
Wait, what,
home.
she did?
Yes, Dorothy makes it home. So whatever that dramatic question was that we posed, we have the answer. It's not always yes, because sometimes the question is, will Dorothy get home from Oz? No, but she's really happy in Oz. Like, that's not what happened, but that could have been an answer. You know, depending. So, for Harry, the moment's actually when he gets back on the train, the Hogwarts Express, and goes back to live with the Dursleys, which that's a literal return to his ordinary world, but he's different, and they're never going to be able to make him sleep in a cupboard again. So those things have changed, but this was just a much better picture. For Usagi, literally, she and her friends go back to their normal lives. We do get a little bit of the setup for the next arc, but that's more almost of like a teaser than the end of the new normal. They're almost giving us the inciting incident for the next one in that episode. But ultimately, what they do is they go back to being ordinary middle school girls. But, you know, Sailor Moon's in a new relationship that's actually an old relationship, but whatever. And, you know, her friends go back to what they were doing before, but now they're friends, which they were not at the beginning of the story. So we have all these new friendships that are solidified, and they're definitely not going anywhere now. For Luke, Luke can't go back home. And why would he do that? He'd just get caught by the Empire. But now he's a hero of the rebellion. So that's kind of his new normal, and we kind of see that in the medal ceremony when they acknowledge what he did blowing up the Death Star. So now he's with the rebellion, which is his new normal. So he's going to be doing rebel things and missions and that kind of stuff. And we get that idea from that scene. And Han too. Han does go through this arc as well. We're just focusing on Luke because he's the obvious hero. For Frodo, Frodo is one of the ones who kind of does it a little bit differently because he goes home to discover that he can't stay there. He does go back to the Shire and he helps rebuild, but then he realizes that what happened to him won't allow him to stay in the Shire. He's got to go do new things, discover new places. So he goes with Gandalf and the elves to the Undying Lands. And that's perfectly fine. Your hero can go back home and then leave. Sometimes that's the ultimate goal, is that Frodo's an explorer now. He's an adventurer. That's what he has to do. And also probably a lot of PTSD, just saying. So now we're going to talk about a tragedy, which is actually the same plot line with just a few very minor differences. We want to talk about this because it is something that we write about, and it's one of the best ways to change this around, to do something new and different with this plot line that we see everywhere. So true tragedy is not the same as a sad story. A story where the hero dies, but you still defeat the villain, or they die for a noble cause, they accomplish their goal and end up dying, that's not a tragedy. It's sad. It's not a tragedy. A tragedy is where the hero's only positive outcome is death by the end. At the beginning, he has lots of options. He or she, whatever, has lots of options. But by the end, the only positive outcome is death, or a metaphorical death. We're going to talk about a literal death, but it could be a metaphorical death. It could be that the only positive option is that they leave the school that they really wanted to go to.
Or just to sort of them never being seen again.
Yeah, disappearing, never being seen again. Exactly. It follows the same plot structure until we reach that midpoint era. And then we'll talk about that. So, any of William Shakespeare's tragedies, they're actual tragedies. Everybody dies. Rogue One. Which sounds weird because you wouldn't think of it as a tragedy because they do accomplish their goal, but ultimately the plot structure is that of a tragedy. And until the next one comes out, Avengers, Infinity War. Our literal original heroes might not be dead, but trust me. We're not going to talk about that one. But, like I said, it can also be a metaphorical death or a victory for the villain, like the villain ultimately wins. And the answer to the dramatic question in this case is probably no. It can be yes, or kind of a maybe not, like what happened to the dramatic question. But like, are Romeo and Juliet going to end up together? No, they die. So my first slide here is an example of something that is sad, but it's not a tragedy. Like, it's super, super sad. I cried a lot watching it the first time. But Kosei is our hero, and Kosei accomplishes his goal. He's able to play the piano again. He learns from this experience and lives a better life because of it. So it's not a tragedy, despite the fact that it's very, very sad. Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy, and we're going to use it to go over the tragic plot points, because yeah, it's Romeo and Juliet. I'm hoping that everybody knows what it is.
Spoilers.
Yes. Lots of spoilers. But I thought about doing something else, but I'm not prepared to talk about any of those yet. Okay. So like I said, it follows the same plot points until we get to the midpoint mirror. It has a call to adventure, which is Romeo and Juliet meeting. We're just skipping the ordinary world because Capulet's Montague is fighting, yay. So they have a call to adventure where they meet. They still have lots of choices at this point. They could meet and have whatever that kissing scene is supposed to be, and then leave and move on and never talk to each other again. Like, it's still a choice. It's probably not the choice they're going to make, but it's a choice. The lock-in is when they get married. Once they're married, they're either gonna have to fix the problems with their family, or something is gonna have to happen, because they're married, and this is a world before divorce. All right, and then the midpoint mirror is Mercutio's death, which occurs directly because Romeo doesn't want to fight Tybalt anymore because he's married to his cousin. So Mercutio's death is a total loss, meaning one of Romeo's best friends dies. That's the death that we get here. And it's an actual death. It's super sad. The tone of this scene mimics the tone of the end because Mercutio is dead. Then, rather than having a really dark moment later, we have a really happy, fun moment. It's when Romeo and Juliet finally spend the night together. And then they have that scene where they argue about whether or not it's morning. So, it switches, it reverses. We get a happy moment where we think, oh, okay, maybe it'll all work out.
No.
All right, so Romeo and Juliet actually kind of do this at slightly different times because we do have two heroes here. We have Romeo and Juliet. For Romeo, it is the moment when Friar Lawrence fails to tell him that Juliet is still alive. Because at that moment, the only positive outcome for him is death. Now, there are a couple places where Friar Lawrence probably could have fixed it from this point, but man, I just really wanted that picture of Leonardo DiCaprio screaming in a Hawaiian shirt. It's a really great picture.
Also makes it really funny is the guy watching in the background.
Yeah. So for Romeo, that's the moment. For Juliet, it's the moment where she wakes up and finds out that Romeo is dead. And he's really actually dead. And so rather than having a happy new world where everyone moves on, everyone's dead. Mercutio, Tybalt, Paris, Romeo, Juliet, they're all dead. The heroes don't get to move on because they're literally dead in this case. Like I said, it could be, for different genres, it may not be a literal death. It may be that the killer gets away, or they kill, well, of course that would be literal, that they kill the detective. It could be that the relationship never comes to fruition. They don't get that happy ending, even if they don't actually die, depending on the story that you're writing. It could be that the hero disappears, or, like I said, if you're doing something more realistic, they move on, they have to change schools, that sort of thing. Whatever they're trying to do doesn't happen. Okay, so just a few tips and tricks. I'm gonna go over these kind of quick, all right? You can still do whatever you want. Like if you're making something, you can still tell the story that you want to tell. I'm not telling you that you have to do it exactly like this. Chances are, if you've written a story or a comic or whatever, chances are you've already done this and you just didn't even know it. But now you know, and now you know how to break the rules. Because people do, they break the rules. Heroes go through this cycle and then fail without it being a tragedy. That sounds super weird, but it happens.
It works, yeah, it works.
So, you can still tell the story however you want to tell. You want to tell it out of order? Tell it out of order. Pulp Fiction's a huge hit. The whole thing's backwards. You just but I'm pretty sure that when they wrote it going forwards and then decided to tell it backwards. Of course, I haven't actually done that much research on that one. So my advice would be, figure out those 5 key plot points before you start, because that's going to tell you whether or not you really have a story. Now, if you're like me, it's going to change. Like as I start writing, I start to realize, actually it would be this moment, not that moment. But if I can come up with those 5, I know I have a story that I can tell. Shorter stories, less complex stories, shorter stories will often have more subtle plot points. Because if you're writing a short story about an average day, it's going to be really subtle. There's probably not going to be anyone almost dying if you're just writing a fluff piece. But it's still going to be there. There's going to be a moment where you're like, no, I dropped my spaghetti. That's one of my favorite. One of my English teachers told us a story about a guy who makes spaghetti and then drops it and then has to order out. Like, it's a whole story. It hits all 5 plot points in 5 sentences. Like, you can do it, And simpler stories will actually have more obvious plot points. Like I said, 5 sentences, each one is of a plot point. You can do it if you want to. Some of the common mistakes are that we spend too long in the in-between bits. Animes are notorious for this. Okay, all those episodes of filler. That's what this is. It's them messing up, basically. Now, they get away with it because they do this arc in every single episode, so you stay interested. Because this is honestly a really interesting way to do things. That's exactly how it happens. And sometimes the arc will span a few episodes. Obviously, if you have like 2 or 4, if you're watching a show in 8 parters, sometimes. And then we're adding scenes and characters that you don't even need. Like, they're not important, they don't do anything. Why are they there? There can be more than one arc going on at a time. Like I said, if you have a group of heroes, they may do things at different points. And you can do that, it's fine. You just have to keep track of it all. And a hero can fail without it being a tragedy. If the hero gets to the end of their story and meets their goal but doesn't learn anything, hasn't grown, hasn't changed, they've failed. This actually happens a lot in comedy. Mostly so that the writers can go back and write another story about the person doing the same dumb things they did before that made us laugh. Which is, like I said, it's a perfectly legitimate way to tell a story, but technically that hero has failed. Think of it as a roadmap. It's not like the exact way you have to do things. Some stories don't have a mentor. Some stories don't have a villain. You don't always need one. It's not the only thing that's going to make your story bad. If you have really engaging characters and world building, like I said, you can get away with 40 episodes of filler. 40! You can get away with that because we all really loved the Sailor Scouts. We could watch them beat up bad guys all day. We did. That's what happened. And if you have really lame characters, then we don't care about your story. Which sounds terrible, but you have to, and your character can be a terrible person. That's not what I'm saying. But if you don't develop them well, you can still have a story that doesn't work. And same with world building if that's necessary. If it's our world, then it's kind of our world, All right, so some quick notes on different genres. Romances almost always have two heroes. You know, the two people, two. I guess you could have more. That's the kind of romance you want to write. Like I said, TV, comics, serial, other serial things can have this arc every episode or an overarching plot or both. Shows comic that do it every episode, usually short in the ordinary world. So if you want to have a monster of the week thing, which is fine, I mean, don't get me wrong, lots of people really enjoy those. You're probably not going to tell them every single time that Usagi is a 14-year-old schoolgirl and her blood type is whatever it was, because they did it every episode. But you don't have to. We already know that. The audience already knows that by episode 10. Typical hero stories are going to have a more obvious arc, obviously. If you're telling a detective story, there's other plot points that only happen in detective stories that follow these plot points, but are different. All right, got 4 minutes. All right, but yeah, the more typical hero story you have, the more obvious it is if you're following this or not. So I have some additional resources. 2 particular things that I found really helpful. Both of these are geared a little bit more at writers, but to a certain extent, if you're going to tell a story, you're going to be a little bit of a writer, even if you're making a comic or trying to make an animation. Or a fan fiction, any of it. The first one is The Writer's Journey, Mythic Structures for Writers. I'm using the 3rd edition, so that's what I put up here. Christopher Vogler literally worked on The Lion King and Fight Club. And like every other movie you can think of, made after about 1975. Seriously, he's the guy. Technically he's a story consultant. He's the one that directors and writers call in Hollywood when something's not working. They call him and he comes and he fixes their stories. So he wrote a book. It's great. You should read it. He does talk about a lot of stuff from the 90s, because that's when the book was written. So there's a lot of movies in there that I still haven't even seen that he talks about, but it's okay. The other one that I'm recommending is called whatisaplot.com. It's run by a lady named Shonda Grimes, and she runs the Ninja Writers. And they are a writing group, and they do focus on writing, but I highly recommend, she does this thing called the Plotting Workshop 2 or 3 times a year. She usually does it for free. You can sign up for her emails at whatisaplot.com, and I highly recommend that if you're trying to make something that you want out there, that you take it through the plotting workshop. It's really great. And like I said, it is a little bit more geared towards writers, but it'd be really easy to adapt for like a comic book or anything like that. If you're here in San Antonio, we have the San Antonio Writers Guild. They usually meet the first Thursday of every month, various places. They have a website. If you're not here, I suggest you just Google your town writers group. You're probably going to get about 15 different groups that meet at different times for different genres. Even if you're not really a writer, I'm sure they'd be happy to help you figure out what's wrong, or work with you on what you can do. So I'm not super present online, but if you want to find me, I have a Pinterest under R. Stockton. That one's dedicated to storytelling. So it's got, Pinterest is another great resource, by the way. If you type in writing tips, look at every blog. Some of them are great, some of them are not. Some of them are like, yeah, okay, that was really obvious. I have a Medium. I don't know if you guys know about Medium, but you can publish articles. I haven't actually published anything there yet, but I have one. And if you guys really want to read my really old writing, you can find my DeviantArt. You can also look at my terrible pictures. Yeah, I don't have a Twitter or an Insta or anything. All right, we have like 1 minute or no minutes, but thank you guys for coming. If you have questions, I guess I'll do it there.